On the day after Christmas in 1996 at 7:13 a.m., Officer Carl Veitch of the Boulder Police Department secured the 3-page ransom note that was found in the Ramsey home and transported it to headquarters, where he booked the note into evidence. Ever since, the ransom note became the best piece of evidence in the case of JonBenet Ramsey. But somehow, over the years, under a veil of smoke and mirrors, the ransom note was replaced by 3 single letters as the best evidence in the case: DNA, which should stand for does not account for any of the other evidence in this case, including the ransom note. Let's bring the ransom note back where it belongs, to the front and center of this investigation, where the truth may be right in front of us.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Examining the Evidence in the case of JonBenet Ramsey. In this episode, I will uncover what I call the weaponization of the DNA, which is the use of alternative facts, loaded words, and logical fallacies, all spun together with a shock and awe public relations campaign that fans the flame of public anger and disbelief, all while exploiting the naivete of the general public, taking advantage of their lack of knowledge and operational awareness by misrepresenting the relevance of the DNA evidence in this case and how it is classified in cases similar to JonBenet Ramsey. We will go beyond the headlines of the investigation, and I will show you how the DNA is being weaponized by certain characters of this case to gain favor with the public and to further demonize and disparage the Boulder police. Let's begin with a look into the investigative methodologies and techniques that are used when there is a possible case of intimicide, which is what I call a close-knit type of murder. When you have a victim who is killed within the 4 walls of their own home or living quarters, that they usually share or live in with someone who they had some level of emotionality with, a family member, a spouse, a partner, a boyfriend or girlfriend, who are statistically more likely to be the offender than an unknown outsider suspect. In these cases, typical and well-known hardline evidence such as DNA, fingerprints, blood, or fiber evidence take a secondary seat to circumstantial evidence, which is usually not recovered at the scene of the crime. The reason why circumstantial evidence becomes primary in cases such as this is that any attorney or criminal defense counsel could argue in front of a judge and jury, and quite convincingly, that any potential damning DNA, blood, fingerprints, shoe prints, or fiber evidence against their client is irrelevant, because both the victim and their client's DNA are expected to be found in the common living spaces of their home. We slept in the same bed. We hugged and kissed all night. We shared a bathroom, used the same fingernail clippers, wore the same shoes and clothes, used the same laundry machine, so on and so forth. So, DNA, fingerprint, and fiber evidence in these cases isn't going to likely reveal to an investigator, judge, or jury the story of what occurred between the victim and the suspect within the 4 walls of their home that night. But you know what might? Victimology and suspectology, digging into the history of the victim and learning nearly everything about them, as same as the suspects. This alone may reveal who the most likely suspect is. Other circumstantial evidence like interpersonal dynamics and behavior, along with other critical things such as calls and text and emails and other data extracted by mobile phone forensics. The problem is, the CSI effect has created a myth that every case can be solved via DNA or fingerprints. This in turn has spawned the current CSI generation, who are misinformed on how modern cases, especially domestic homicides or potential intimicides, actually get solved. Now, let's look into how the DNA is being weaponized in the media and investigative claim that I've seen floating around out there in the media and the internet for about a year or so. The claim is that the initial results of the early serological and DNA testing, which was completed in the first weeks and months after the murder in 1997, showed that no DNA from the Ramsey family was found on anything incriminating, such as her clothing or body. Therefore, the police should have immediately exonerated, excluded, or cleared the Ramsey family as suspects or from having any involvement in this crime. Further, they say, the Boulder police hid the results from them and their attorneys as well as from the public. Okay, we touched on this a little bit earlier. This isn't how the investigative process works in this type of case. The reality is, it simply doesn't work that way. Just because there was no DNA that matched the Ramseys in the early DNA testing results that came back, doesn't mean that the Ramseys should have been automatically excluded or cleared in this case. And as I touched on earlier, the same goes for if the Ramsey family DNA was found at the scene on some of JonBenet's clothing or body, pillows, blankets, or even on one of the murder weapons in this case. This wouldn't automatically make them guilty or even mean they had something to do with the crime. The only exception to this would be incriminating seminal fluid type DNA that matched the family, and in this case, there is not. Another shock and awe claim I've seen in the media is that the paintbrush handle, or what Dr. Meyer called a wooden stick, which was used in the construction of the murder weapon, has never been tested for DNA. This isn't entirely accurate, and we will dig into the DNA documents in a moment. But I would also like to address the people online and in social media asking if the Ramseys were guilty, why would there be a continued public push for more testing of the DNA? And the answer is simple, because it is a win-win, no-lose situation for the Ramseys. And this is how. Let's say new DNA testing revealed that Patsy's DNA is on the paintbrush handle, or what you may call the garrote. Would this be damning? No, it would actually make sense. It was Patsy's paintbrush from her own paint tray. She painted often and even took lessons at CU in the months prior to Christmas in 1996. If Brother Burke's DNA was found on it, no big deal. We know Burke in the months and even weeks before the murder had a propensity to whittle wooden sticks with his pocket knife all around the house, including the basement where, according to him, he used to play all of the time. What about John? He could easily say, I bought that paintbrush from McGuckin's hardware store and gave it to Patsy myself. Later, I used it to stir paint for her before she painted. So, as you can see, there really is no risk in asking for new DNA testing on the public stage for the paintbrush or any of the other evidentiary items. However, continuing to push for this in the media is not only a misrepresentation of the evidence, but also misdirection away from the other crucial pieces of evidence in this case. Is it true that the paintbrush part of the murder weapon has never been tested for DNA? We will have to dig deep into the DNA documents and reports to find that answer. So, the first mention of the broken paintbrush comes from a Colorado Bureau of Investigation's lab report from February 1997 and is listed as item number 27, broken paintbrush. The initial serological testing found that no blood was indicated on the paintbrush, and it was subsequently forwarded to the DNA section for further testing. Although we do not have the results of those tests, digging deeper into the documents, we do find out more about the forensic testing of the paintbrush from inter-office memorandums and other case documents from 2007. In this memo dated November 7, 2007, from the Boulder District Attorney's Office put together by Chief Investigator JonBenet, and if we stroll down, we find a section titled History of Items Submitted for DNA Analysis. And when we stroll a bit further, we find the paintbrush handle, and it reads in part, the paintbrush used in the formation of the garrote was broken on either end. This section of the paintbrush handle measured about 4.5 inches in length. The paint tray and contents belonged to the Ramseys. Patsy enjoyed painting as a hobby. No blood was indicated on the paintbrush handle. No fingerprints suitable for identification purposes were developed from the paintbrush handle. no DNA was developed from this item. In 2008, new testing of many evidentiary items was sought by the Boulder authorities. This time, the items were tested using a rather new method at the time, touch or trace DNA. The broken paintbrush handle was again submitted for testing at the labs of Bode Technology in Lorton, Virginia. However, reading through an investigative memo compiled by Chief Investigator Andy Harita, he tells us while preparing his presentation for the Bode scientist, he noticed that the forensic knot expert from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Corporal John Van Tassel, appeared not to be wearing protective gloves in photos depicting his analysis and reconstruction of the knots. Furthermore, the paintbrush piece that was used to construct the knot was depicted in photographs of the ungloved expert. And it was likely because of this and other possible sources of contamination that the forensic scientist declined to test the paintbrush handle in 2008. And therein lies the problem, and it's a huge problem. The reality is the paintbrush handle, one half of the murder weapon, is heavily compromised. In addition to the contamination listed in the memo, I can think of, just off the top of my head, a few other examples of how the paintbrush handle was compromised after the discovery of JonBenet. For starters, in the memo there is mention of how John Ramsey might have touched the garrote after finding JonBenet. This statement alone is enough for any jury to raise reasonable doubt. Furthermore, when Ramsey brought her upstairs, he set her down on the floor by the front door. Numerous people had just walked over that very spot in the hours before JonBenet was found. Another 20 or so did the same just 2 days before at the Ramsey Christmas party. Detective Arndt then moved her again to the living room and set her down on the carpet underneath the three wise men by the Christmas tree, where just a day before the family had opened all of their Christmas gifts. To make matters worse, according to the police reports, after her death was called into police headquarters by Arndt, and before the multiple officers responded back to the Ramsey home, Patsy Ramsey was seen holding and coddling JonBenet next to her body, crying and weeping over her for nearly 15 minutes, with the paintbrush handle likely lodged somewhere in between JonBenet's clothing and hers, causing even more contamination. There is likely a lot more, but you get the point, which is there will be no DNA bingo at the end of the rainbow on the paintbrush handle or garrote. The paintbrush isn't just a one-off either. There are issues with most of the evidence in this case, due to the nature of the crime and how she was found and such, and the crime scene which had multi-levels of contamination throughout. This is one of the reasons why we talked about earlier that in these type of cases, the popular CSI effect evidence, DNA, fingerprints, blood, hair, and fibers, is second seat to the circumstantial evidence. It's unlikely that any future DNA testing will ever bring a successful prosecution of anyone in this case. This is not a case you will see solved on TikTok. This isn't a case while you're scrolling your phone at 3 a.m. where you will come across a headline that reads, "The JonBenet Ramsey case was solved by familiar DNA." That's the reality of the evidence in this case. This is a circumstantial evidence case, and always has been and always will be.
This is a difficult case. This is a circumstantial evidence case. Those cases take longer. They require more patience. And I hope that...
So no amount of pressure or public admonishment of the police is going to solve or settle this case. Weaponizing the DNA and other circumstances of the investigation in the media will undoubtedly continue to shine the Ramseys in a favorable light. But if you know the history of this case, which is likely never to have a criminal trial, it has always been about appealing to the court of public opinion. And almost 28 years later, it's 28 years the same. I ended my last episode by bringing attention to the 4 key pieces of evidence that I believe define this case. The evidence on these items, or the lack thereof, reveals to me what kind of case and crime scene we are dealing with. The 4 pieces of evidence are the flashlight, the ransom note, the Sharpie pen used to write the note, and the paintbrush handle. Mysteriously, just like the paintbrush handle, the other 3 items of evidence also seem to be absent of DNA. But that's not all. In addition, these 4 crucial evidentiary items are also absent of fingerprints. But how is that so? These are all everyday regular household items that you would commonly find in any home or residence. And for someone who has worked numerous staged and suspicious death cases, this is a red flag. Sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence. Historically, these circumstances remind me of the baby Charles Lindbergh case. After the so-called kidnapping, the police methodically scoured every surface in little Lindy's nursery for fingerprints. Amazingly, there were no fingerprints found anywhere in the nursery whatsoever, including the crib, windowsill, or even the ransom note. Even if the kidnapper wore gloves, there should have been a plethora of fingerprints, especially from the nanny Betty Gow and her mother Ann Lindbergh. One of the officers that responded to the scene that night commented, "I'm damned if I don't think somebody washed everything in that nursery before the fingerprint men got there." Incredibly, Charles Lindbergh didn't even open the ransom note, which was sealed in an envelope and purportedly left by the kidnapper on the windowsill in the nursery. Lindbergh's lack of curiosity as to what was in the envelope should have raised suspicions. He announced his son had been taken by kidnappers, but didn't open the note or let anyone in the home open it until the fingerprint unit arrived, which was some 3 hours after the police responded to the Lindbergh estate. And of course, when they did, there were no fingerprints found on the envelope or the note. Imagine that. Another case that jumps out to me right away is the case of the mail bomber Walter Leroy Moody. Moody is a guy who sent multiple mail bombs in the 70s and 80s that killed 2 people and injured others. When suspicion fell on him, his home was thoroughly searched by the police. Investigators couldn't find one single piece of evidence connecting Moody to the bombs. However, it wasn't about what was found, it was about what they didn't find. What was quite telling and raised suspicions of the investigators even further was normal, common, everyday household items that may be used to fabricate a bomb, such as wire, pliers, nails, flashlights, batteries, even nuts and bolts, were all missing from his house. Moody had also kept most of his old school books from university, including the law books he had studied in an attempt to become a lawyer. However, one noticeable subject was missing from his in-home library: chemistry. Months later, acting on a tip, investigators searched a home where he had rented storage space. Inside, they found all the bomb-making materials that were missing from his home: pipes, wires, batteries, a cache of weapons, and of course, all of Moody's missing chemistry books. Moody was eventually convicted and died by lethal injection in 2018. The staging in those 2 cases is just a small example of how the absence of evidence can be evidence. In the Ramsey case, these 4 pieces of evidence that played a role in the circumstances of JonBenet's death, along with other fabricated elements, indicate that the Ramsey crime scene was staged, which was further forensically contaminated, therefore compromised, in the hours after Patsy summoned the police and called over her friends. The integrity of the crime scene was lost long before JonBenet was even found. As an investigator, when you recognize a crime scene is possibly altered, polluted, or staged, you can no longer investigate the case as you would most others. The misrepresentation of the evidence in this case has always been evident. Like Patsy's paintbrush, a broken wooden stick somehow became a sensational, sadistic garrote. Appealing to the masses and the media, claiming this case can be solved simply by the DNA, is a false flag fictional tale. Soon, another season of snow will fall upon the most famous Tudor Brick house in Boulder, further covering and concealing what happened in this house over 10,000 nights ago. Since then, the evidence in this case has often been misrepresented, which in turn created a malignant mythology that still persists today. The greatest trick, however, was getting the people to believe that a few picograms of DNA, and not the 3 pages of see with your own eyes evidence, is the key to solving this case. Are you watching closely?